Alright, this is Castle. I'm about to do a blueprint that mimics the gameplay of Quake 1 and Unreal 4. And I did a little bit of preparation uh, uh, already, but very minor things. It was basically setting up the player pawn. Did not have like worthless variables and stuff like that. I'll show you in a moment, or right now. That actually makes more sense. What the hell else was I gonna do? Okay, so now I'm a tiny little window in the lower right side of the screen. It was weird. Okay, so let me kind of go over this. If you do a fresh project for is it the FPS template, you'll have a little bit more stuff than this. I kind of pruned things down a little bit. Um, like there was a whole bunch of variables for the the gun. Uh, where the bullets are supposed to come out of the weapon. There's is actually like a transform that sits in front of the player so that the bullet doesn't come from your origin, which is what would actually happen if you didn't have this. I made that so that it's just sitting here as part of the weapon fire function, and jump is intact. There was input for controller input, and there was input for if this was if it had a touch screen. I nuked those because PC Master Race, PC Master Race. But um, it's very easy to add that stuff back in at another point in time. Really, all I wanted to do was just prune this down. And in the viewport, if you look at this, I went ahead and got rid of the hand models because that stuff doesn't exist in Quake, and centered the weapon model, which is a pretty neat little gun. It's a neat little gun, and just literally have it sitting in front of the camera. So this guy right here, he's the first person camera, and here's the weapon, and it's pared down. Like I just got rid of a bunch of extra crap. So in this video, I'm not going to actually be going over the the blueprint work so much as the preparation, which I think this is one of the things that'll make everybody's life a hell of a lot easier if you follow this. You see how in this blueprints folder, I didn't have any starter content or any of that junk. You don't have to have any of it. Don't put it in. Or you can just use this project. Whatever. Anyway, see how there's blueprints here, and then all the blueprints are like stuffed into one folder? That is not acceptable because there's going to be a lot of blueprints. So these each have to have their own subfolders. Okay, so just to kind of get things started off, you have characters, your game type, weapons, and HUD. Okay, now the HUD, I'm not going to do the standard Quake 1 HUD. I'm actually probably going to do something that's a little bit more similar to Reflex's HUD, which is just easier on the eyes visually. It conveys things a lot better. And I mean, it's pretty much the same thing, give or take. So if you're not familiar, Reflex is like a Quake 3 CPMA based. Oh, I'm sure if you don't know what Reflex is, then that probably doesn't answer that. Okay. So we got your character, and your HUD's not supposed to be in here. How'd that happen? Not acceptable. Why did it act so like crazy whenever I just moved the HUD? Now, I'm going to be using a widget for the HUD. This first person HUD thing, it is not necessary. Also, I should probably stop talking whenever I'm doing the best segments. Okay. Okay, so I set up the player the player spawn point where I want the player to spawn, and I removed the pawn because that is not how I want the character to spawn into the level. I don't want the player spawning into the level on a character. I want the player spawning because they are the player pawn. I made another folder called player, and HUD goes inside of player. The way I'm setting up the way I'm setting up the blueprints is how the hierarchy of the engine actually works. What goes in player is something called the player controller, which the player controller is what you use to what each and every single client that connects to the game uses this object, one of these, a copy of it, basically. So you are the player controller. And the only way that you gain control over any of the objects in the level, characters, is by possessing them. And I'll explain how you can automatically possess stuff when the game mode starts. Now, there's another thing in game mode, and then there's game state, which is also extremely important. I'm going to call it deathmatch, and first person is going to be renamed to deathmatch as well. Okay, so how this works, these two guys right here. Game state is keeping track of the rules of the game. Everything that's super important that's going on right now for whatever game mode you are currently playing. So like everybody's score, this object tries to keep track of all that to properly convey to the scoreboard what's going on. And also the game mode the game mode isn't what's currently happening right now, but rather a collection of all of the rules that you use to set the game state up. Okay, so for example, when you're creating a server and you do space dash max clients, that's game mode that decides that. So game mode is the one that will decide what does max clients mean, and game state will say, oh, we currently during the game we currently have 8 of 8 players playing. That means that somebody can't jump in. So game mode is like, actually I believe you could talk to game mode through command lines when you're starting a server and stuff like that. And game state is what's currently going on in the game. These two are really important. Now, there's player controller and there's player state. Oops, what did I just do? Oh, get away from me. Okay, so player state, player controller and player state are pretty complicated in terms of there's just so many different ways that you can use these two objects. But player state by default keeps track of things like what your name is, how many points do you have, how many frags, how many, but it's not stuff that's related to your character so much. Like player controller, you might want to keep track of things like what your inventory is, provided you don't lose stuff when you die, right? Stuff that you keep on your pawn is stuff that goes away if that pawn is destroyed. But player controller, if it's stored on player controller, it doesn't go away, it stays there. Okay, so this structure is a big list of default values, all right? What you do is it's a very quick way for the blueprint system to say, oh, here's a big list of variables. Let's apply them all right now in a very seamless, very efficient manner. Structures are really useful because you can do all kinds of stuff with them. You can call on to different things and just call a structure for a projectile, and boom, that projectile now knows exactly what it is and how it's going to behave. Believe it or not, I'm going to make this default projectile class is probably going to be the same projectile for every single gun. It's just going to call a struct that has all of the information that give the characteristics to the projectile. We're going to be using structs a lot. In fact, we'll go ahead and make a weapon struct as well. Now you notice I'm doing all of this groundwork and trying to get everything in place. Now there's a reason for this, and it's something that I've failed to do in all of my previous projects, but now I know that it's a good idea to set everything up, set up the skeleton of the project first, and then you can actually like start hooking things up in such a way where you only have to cast one time as soon as the object is created. So for everything in the game, every object will know exactly what all of the other important relevant objects are to it. It's really useful. Okay, so I'm going to make the default HUD widget as well. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I don't use this. Actually, that was another thing that I did, was I went in and I just cleared out the first person HUD. There's no crosshair. I'll add that stuff myself using the widget system. Now, unlike projectile, I don't need to have an actor for a weapon struct. The reason why is because the weapon object already exists on the player pawn as a skeletal mesh. So if you look in the viewport, this guy right here will be affected by information. So whenever you switch weapons, this model just switches out to whatever the other weapon is, based on whatever is in that struct. Okay, I think I got everything in place. So see if I can think about anything else. Okay, so once you have all of these objects set up or in place and they exist and they're named correctly and they're all their default values or whatever the hell, the first thing you're gonna have to do is go into game mode. So this is the deathmatch game mode, and you see how here there's classes, and you gotta set all of these up to be all of the new stuff that you just made. Oh god, which are the two player controllers? Oh, okay. All right, so there's two of them there. I guess I'm just calling everything default. Default player HUD. Weapons, default projectile, projectile struct, weapon struct. All right. So I was thinking about it. Like I had to kind of stop for a second and think about it, but instead of default, which can be confusing, I'm naming all of the files, at least for now, Qt, and then the name of the object. The reason why is that's QuakeTemplate. It'll make it, all of the new stuff will be alphabetically sorted the same. It'll be a little bit easier to find everything, and I'll always know. I won't have to like double guess which is the one, which is the default C++ object that already existed with the project, or what is unique to QuakeTemplate. So I just realized that was going to be a bit of a pain in the butt, and it's actually a good idea to get that out of the way sooner than later. So back to the game mode. Okay, so Qt HUD, Qt player controller. I'm not changing the spectator. Qt player controller again. Replay? Thing? That appears to be some kind of new thing. Qt player state, and of course Qt deathmatch game state. Now I'm specifying deathmatch because the default mode that I'm going to set up is just free-for-all deathmatch. That's going to be the first thing that gets set up. Now all the objects are set up, and there's quite a bit to learn in terms of understanding the full hierarchy. But the characters are the pawns. Game mode, game type is your game state. Game mode and game state. Game mode and game state. Player controller, which is you. You are the player controller. Player state, which is like information about you, your HUD, how you know how you the game communicates to you basically. The HUD is only on the client. Can't do any server-side stuff on the. And that's the other really complicated thing. I'll get into that later. Um, the projectile base, a struct for projectiles, and a weapon struct. So this is all set up, and the game type or the game mode is now hooked up to all of the regular things. I'm using the regular spectator spawn. So right now I have a player spawn placed in the level, but it doesn't really matter because it appears that there's been some changes to the logic and how this is all set up. So like right now this is actually a really good thing. When you spawn in as a default spectator, which is totally cool with me. But it does mean that there's going to need to be a little extra logic in order to be able to find the player spawn point that I want to use. And hell, I mean, I don't even need to use the player spawn points. I can use some other object. So it has to find the player spawn point, pick one, and then spawn the pawn of the player character on that object, and then have the player controller possess it. Actually, after thinking about it a little bit more, in this particular case, it does make sense to replace the spectator because I can make a QuakeTemplate spectator where if I left click, then it informs game state that I'm ready to go, and then game state can tell the player controller, hey, spawn me, and player controller will like search the entire level for spawn points and then do all that stuff right then and there, pow, like super fast and super easy. So I am going to actually modify the default spectator. It just makes sense. It's kind of funny. The spectator spawn point actually uses the regular spawn points. I guess that's how it works in Quake, doesn't it? I don't know. I may have to do something unusual and load up Quake again rather than just going off of total memory of everything. Okay. Yeah, that might be slightly logical. And of course, first person template. QuakeTemplate. I wonder if I'm gonna get in trouble legally. Ah, nah, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Okay, so I didn't say Quake 1, I just said Quake. Alright. And it's not like I'm using assets from the game or anything like that. No. Okay. So sorry, kitty cat distraction. Aw, can't see the cat. Oh god, the camera's probably all messed up. Okay, so the easiest one to get started with is gonna be character. pawn. So here's all this default like movement stuff, things like that. So we're not gonna worry too much about spawn projectile and all of that. These things down. And the very beginning, I almost would consider this to be like a begin play. Would be like your header files or whatever. Okay, so like for one example is I'm gonna want the player controller. So I'm gonna actually ut. Here we go. Okay, so it's player controller, right? Now I made a variable here that's pointing to the new player controller object. That means that I can immediately access all of its variables and anything that I need. The only thing is that it's just the player controller. There's nothing defining which player controller it is, who it is. If I have 4 people on the server, this variable doesn't point to any of those 4 people. And so that is the first thing that has to happen. But let me say, like, okay, I'm gonna do Qt player controller, and I'm gonna need uh, another one, and this one's gonna be the HUD. So it'll be type Qt, and here's the player. Yep, Qt player HUD. All right. Now, once again, it has absolutely no idea which HUD, who it's talking to. I'm just listing all of the relevant objects that this entity needs to, talk to. Okay, so these are all the things that I typically would have the pawn talk to. The game state, player controller, player state, player HUD, projectile struct, and weapon struct. So now I have these 2 structs sitting here as well. I'm not sure off the top of my head if I need to have the structs actually set up as variables, or if I can just call them when I need to and just have it work. I'll have to take a look. But this is pretty much it. And very often I'll have the pawn, you know, run a function on the HUD. In fact, really all I want the HUD to do is just gather a bunch of information on its own. Like it just sort of like hangs out over here and doesn't interact with anything and just looks at everything whenever something changes and then just like displays it on the screen. So now that these objects are here, how do I make sure that I don't have to cast to them or do any weird shit in order? Well, I have to cast once when they spawn. Casting is actually an expensive process. So I just do it once when this object is created, and there you go. Okay, so here's the first example. Is now the pawn will know what the game state is. The first thing I do is I check to see if the game state variable is valid. In other words, it's probably a null. It's not actually pointing to anything. It just is something. Okay, so if it's not valid, then cast the game state, get game state, do all that, set this variable to that. Now I can talk directly to game state and never have to deal with anything. Although in this example, I'm probably not going to be doing much talking with game state. It's just nice when all I have to do from now on is this, and I can talk to game state. I got all the variables, I got all the functions on game state. Everything is relevant to game state. All I did was I just dragged this one simple fucking node out, and pow! From now on, once it's done, it's done. It saves so much fucking time. If you don't do it this way, then you're gonna have to cast the game state like all the fucking time or whatever. But maybe game state's not the best example. The HUD is a pretty damn good example. All right, so there you go. Player controller, player state, do the same exact thing again. Now the HUD is actually a little bit more complicated because the HUD is going to be initialized on the player controller. So in this, I'm going to literally grab the player controller and then grab the HUD variable and then just so this one right here uh, will happen in a file swoop. It'll be like more than one thing off of this same player controller thing. It'll be exactly the same thing as before. So it's like the first thing that spawns is the player controller. Then the spectator is a pawn. So the it's just basically another type of object that you control. The Qt player HUD. And dark purple means that it's an object template, or yeah, it's not an actual spawned object. It's just a cookie cutter version of that object. And I'm going to set. Okay, so in character, do things a little tiny bit differently. So I have, yeah, see how it's sitting in default? Okay, so this is a reference to the player HUD. I know this is probably already confusing, but okay, so this goes to player state, set. Oh, interesting. I have to cast. Get all this casting out of the way. Do it in one shot. Do it early. That way you don't have to cast every 5 seconds. If you look at my RPG, I cast everywhere. This knows what's up. Like, I don't have to do any fancy bull crap. I just reference these variables, and I don't have to do any confusing shit. It's so much easier if you do it this way. Okay, so of course it's going to take forever just to get everything set up, but I think it's important as it is. Anyway, I'll shut up on fast motion for a little bit. Alright. All the objects know about each other, and I was making some decisions here and there about how I wanted to organize things, and I at one point I wanted to try and maybe set the QT character to be a base character, and then make a player character. That way I can derive important stuff to PCs and stuff like that. But that quickly failed, and I think that if I create any like NPC characters, they're gonna have to have their own base that's not derived from QT character, because it's just doesn't I don't know, it doesn't seem in my gut like the enemies in Quake really derived anything from the player other than really basic pawn related attributes that it doesn't make any sense. You know, the ogre in Quake was a very specific character with a chainsaw and a grenade launcher, and although he fired similar grenades, which is super easy to do without deriving anything from the player character. Well, anyway, I'm just gonna go with this for now. Game state, I'm probably going to make QT player starts, so I won't be just using regular player starts. I'm going to make something that's derived off of them. And these will be QT deathmatch player starts that are specific to the deathmatch game mode. And game state will be responsible to actually uh, round up all the player spawns and keep all those things. So I'm still at this point in time, I still have some stuff left to do as far as making sure everything knows what's going on with everything else, and I still haven't hooked up the player HUD yet. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff kind of just like spider webbing right now, but uh, you know what's kind of funny? I've already made 1/4 of Project Stray. Just knowing how to do it has saved me so much fucking time. This is already 1/4 of a mod that took a month to make. Okay, well, let's see if I can keep this momentum. Okay, so I do things a little differently with the HUD. Rather than event construct, basically, um, in the player control, what I'm going to do is, after this is all set up, very short wait. Right, it's delay. Yeah, 2 seconds. What this does is it just makes sure that spectator and player spawn and all the other things are all set up before I add this to the view. And what I'm going to do is, this actually could be kind of bad if it could create a bad effect where like the character spawns and then the HUD shows up, but I don't think it's going to be. So since this is the QC player HUD, I have access to all of the variables. So instead of get, I'm going to do set. So character, I'm going to get set. Controller. character controller, state, player state, and the spectator. Okay, yeah, I think it's just 4 things. Controller, state, character, player state, character, spectator. Okay. So then I'm just gonna manually set all of this. That. Now this should work unless there's some kind of a replication issue, which I don't think there was in this case. Being the HUD, anything that comes after this little TV screen here, all this stuff is client side only. So I don't think there's going to be a replication issue. Anyway, back to fast mode. Okay, so all right. Now we need spawn points for deathmatch. I'm gonna make a new folder, reference directory. I'm gonna call it world, and I'm going to make a blueprint, and it would be spawn player spawning. So it would be player start. Okay. Okay. And this will be QT deathmatch start. Right? Yeah. QT deathmatch start. Pow. Super straightforward. Now the QT deathmatch start won't really have anything fancy as far as its uh, variables or anything like that. In fact, I'm just gonna I may actually not even change anything. Um, so now what I do here is I go QT deathmatch start. Now it's an array, which means that there's a whole bunch of them. So you got to work with arrays a little bit differently in that it's not just one variable, it's actually a list of variables. So what was it? I believe it was like get all. Okay, so it's get all actors of class, and I'm going to say QT. Yeah, I was doing it backwards. T deathmatch start. So what this is going to do, I think I can just get away with it this way. Right? Anyhow. All right. There's probably like an easy way for me. Oh yeah. There's a whole bunch of functions and utilities where like uh, for like spitting out information. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to wait 5 seconds after the match starts, gather up all of the deathmatch spawns that I've placed, throw them into the array, and then spit out a text that says how many spawn points it found. So if it's working correctly, it should say 2. If it says anything different, something went wrong. Okay. God, how long is 5 seconds? Uh-oh. Looks like something went wrong. Oh man, I completely forgot that you have to actually specify the game mode in the level. Damn it. Otherwise it won't run anything. Alright, see it now. Down 2. And interestingly enough, I lost my spawning as a spectator even when it's checked. It's not working. Okay, well, it was neat while that lasted. Uh, it appears my idea to do everything sort of like injecting the values from player controller into the HUD did not work. It says that it's accessing none, which means that it's probably not on the client. Okay, alright. It should still work. I just make sure that it's on the client. Alright, looks like I got everything hooked up. So now I have to add one thing where while I'm in spectator mode, if I left click, it queues me up and spawns me. So that'll be the last thing I do tonight. And time's ticking. It's 12. So I've been doing this for a while. 8 o'clock, okay. but hell of a lot of progress. Might not even seem like that much because I'm still floating around and stuff, but a lot of groundwork is already in place. You'll see it'll come together very quickly. All right, so I got the spawning work. So what I ended up having to do is I have to use this get player get control. For some reason, this was not happy, and this was always really confusing to me because 0. I always thought that that meant like client 0. It actually just means player 1 on this client. So like you can have multiple players on a single client. That's all it's set up to do. I mean, so this is actually the better one to use than over get control. So I'm always going to be client 0, and I'm never going to have split screen or anything like that unless there's like a lot of demand for something like that. I don't think there is. So what happens is event begin play. I set the player controller to this variable. Then you spawn in as a spectator. Now it just picks any of the spawn points because they're all derived from regular spawn points. And if I press the left mouse button, it queues me up. It goes, which is very simplistic. It's not actually queuing me up for anything. But what it's doing is it's running a function server that tells the player controller to unpossess the spectator pawn. Then go to player state, which then references game state, which then references all of the deathmatch spawn points in that array. I get the length of the array, and then I do random integer in range. So the length of the array is an integer, and the maximum number on that integer is the max that, so it just picks a random number within that array. Then I spit it out to get that, and then I get the actor's transform, which is the position in the world space. Well, transform is actually position, rotation, and scale. It's like the whole deal. Put that into here, say spawn Quake template character, and then possess that character. And here's the result. So I spawn in my regular thing, floating around like a spectator would, and then I press left mouse button, boom, in. And I'm running around like a Quake guy with a gun in my chest. Do 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 do. And now it doesn't quite look like a Quake gun. Uh, okay, so I have it now set up where you spawn in as a spectator. Um, there's a lot of extra stuff that I can get done really quickly. For example, make so that the HUD appears and your crosshair appears depending on what your either your spectator or the player character. And did I get? Huh. That's weird because it worked. Okay, so everything seems to be working so far. Um, so with that said, I'm gonna call it a night, and and stay tuned for more. You're watching Castle Does. Stay tuned for